There are millions of Christians right now, sincere, devoted, genuinely faithful, who are quietly living someone else's life. Not because they walked away from God, because they walked perfectly toward a version of God's purpose for their life that was never fully theirs. You've been faithful, you show up, you pray, you serve. And somewhere underneath the routines and the Sunday mornings and the verses shared on quiet nights, there's an ache that doesn't have a clean name. Not doubt, not rebellion, just a half-inch that doesn't fit. Like a life that looks right from the outside but pulls slightly across the chest every time you breathe deeply. You don't look wrong, you just feel wrong. Like you're wearing a suit that was tailored for someone whose shoulders are almost identical to yours. It buttons perfectly. It hangs right, but it was made for someone slightly different on the inside. Here's what nobody tells you: faithfulness and walking in God's purpose are not the same thing. You can be completely faithful to God and still be living at a distance from the life He actually designed for you. The distance isn't about sin, it isn't about doubt. It's about a gap, invisible, quiet, and for some people, decades wide, between doing the right things and inhabiting the right life. There are 5 signs that reveal which side of that gap you're standing on. And by the end, you'll know exactly where you are and what that means for what comes next. Sign 1: performance versus presence. Elijah was running. He had just watched fire fall from heaven, called down the rain, outrun a king's chariot, and now he was hiding in a cave, convinced he was the last faithful person left on earth. Burned out. Spiritually exhausted, and God shows up. The text makes this painfully specific: a wind that tears mountains apart. God is not in the wind, an earthquake. God is not in the earthquake, fire. God is not in the fire. And then after all of that, a still small voice, a whisper. The believer living inside their faith, but not their purpose, is almost always in the earthquake, always measuring their spiritual health by visible intensity. More serving, more showing up, more producing, because the whisper feels like absence, and absence feels like failure. But the encounter that restored Elijah didn't happen in the spectacular. It happened in what survived after everything spectacular went still. If your spiritual life is loudest when it's busiest and goes quiet when you stop moving, that isn't maturity. That's performance. And performance is a suit that looks perfect on the person who was designed for something quieter and far more specific. Sign 2: praying for clarity versus being known. Everyone knows the younger son in the parable. The one who leaves, wastes everything, comes home in rags. But the sign that separates faithful from purpose-walking lives is hidden in the older son. He never left, he worked every day, he was faithful by every visible measure. But when his brother returns and the father throws a celebration, the older son refuses to go in. And in his refusal, he reveals something devastating. He had been obedient his entire life and had never once asked the father for anything. He assumed his obedience was the relationship. This is the prayer of performance. God, show me what to do, give me direction, clarify my calling. It's the prayer of someone managing a spiritual resume. The prayer of purpose sounds different. It sounds like the younger son standing at the edge of the driveway, not presenting credentials, not explaining what he deserves, just asking to be recognized, to be known. The father didn't run toward the one who performed flawlessly. He ran toward the one who came back honestly. Sign 3: spiritual resume versus relationship. Paul had the most impressive spiritual resume in the room. Circumcised on the 8th day, tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew of Hebrews, as for the law, blameless. He wasn't being modest. By every standard his tradition had ever set, he was the most faithful person in the building. And he counted it all as loss. Not because the credentials were bad, because they had become a substitute. The achievements had begun to function as a replacement for the thing they were supposed to point toward. And here is where this sign reaches you directly. A spiritual resume is anything: ministry service, theological depth, church attendance, answered prayers documented over years, that you are holding up as proof of your relationship with God rather than as fruit of it. Purpose walkers carry their history lightly. The faithful but not purpose living carry it carefully, like a suit that needs to stay pressed to mean something. Sign 4: obligation versus encounter. Jesus dictates a letter to the church in Ephesus, and he opens with genuine praise. They have works, labor, endurance. They have tested false teachers and found them wrong. They have not grown weary. By every external measure, this is the healthiest church on the list. Then one sentence collapses everything: but you have abandoned the love you had at first. The Ephesian church had built a perfect spiritual infrastructure, and somewhere inside it, the altar had gone cold. They had the suit immaculately maintained, correctly buttoned, spiritually respectable. and they had stopped feeling anything when they put it on. When faith becomes obligation, you can serve every day and be drifting. When it remains encounter, you show up imperfectly and know you've been found. The Christian walking in God's purpose doesn't have a better spiritual track record. They have something different, a burning bush they can't walk past without stopping. This is the quiet weight of this gap. It doesn't feel like disobedience. It feels like discipline. It looks like faithfulness. From the outside, nothing signals that something is missing. Which means you can live inside it for years, for decades, without anyone seeing it, including yourself. The suit stays pressed. The calendar stays full. And underneath all of it, in the place where purpose should be living, there is a silence that faithfulness alone cannot fill. Sign 5 is structure versus trust. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. Not knowing where he was going. He didn't have a destination. He didn't have a timeline or a framework or a 5-year spiritual strategy. He left the city. He left the structure. He left the identity that had been built inside it. And what he left behind wasn't broken. It worked perfectly. Because God's purpose doesn't call you away from failure. It calls you away from a version of success that no longer fits. The specific sign for you is this. If the idea of God leading you outside the spiritual structure you've carefully built produces more anxiety than the idea of staying safely inside it, you may be standing right at the threshold of the life you were actually designed for, unable to step through because the suit you're wearing is too well fitted to let you move freely. Abraham didn't leave because he had no attachments. He left because he trusted something more than the attachments. And that trust, not the departure itself, is what Scripture calls faith. God never asked you to wear someone else's suit. The life He designed for you doesn't pull across the chest when you breathe. It doesn't require you to adjust the collar during honest moments of prayer. It doesn't look right from the outside while feeling foreign on the inside. Walking in God's purpose doesn't replace faithfulness. It's what faithfulness was always pointing toward. Every act of obedience, every season you endured without clarity, every prayer that felt unanswered, none of it was wasted. It was the process of being fitted for what was always yours. The question was never whether you've been faithful. The question is whether you've been willing to hear the whisper after the earthquake stops, whether you've come home honestly instead of just performing correctly. Whether you've held your credentials loosely enough to let them become fruit instead of proof. God's purpose for your life doesn't live inside the earthquake. It never did. It lives in the specific quiet that only comes after everything else goes still. And the moment you stop adjusting the collar and start asking whose life you've actually been living, that's the moment the real calling begins.